4 o'clock. Room looks pretty full, so I'll make a start. Right, so I'm Brendan Griffin, Cloud Architect at Oracle, and today I'm here to talk about the OCI Generative AI Agent service, which is something that I'm quite passionate about, as you'll probably gather by the end of this session today. The idea behind this session is to give you a little bit of a flavour for what the Generative AI Agent service can do, some example use cases, and also some demonstrations where I'll walk you through the configuration, how it could look like in real life if implemented within an organisation. But to just make sure that we're all level setted before we start to understand exactly what an agent is. So in basic terms, AI agents help users get faster, more accurate answers to their questions. The little bit that I couldn't fit on the slide, which would have made it a little bit more complex, is that because agents are such an evolutionary service, specifically within OCI, new capabilities are getting added all of the time. And recently we've added the ability to do other things, such as getting an agent to do a task for you. So rather than just purely using an agent to answer a question, they can now also go off, call APIs and do all sorts of other cool stuff, which I'll step through later on. So no presentation would be amiss without a nice little statistic. So at the minute, 88% of organisations are either piloting or exploring AI agents. I work with OCI daily, and most of my customers are looking at AI in some form. And the AI agent service is actually really good because it's fairly simple to deploy, and it's got really quick time to value. So we've seen lots of customers show interest in this and go through and develop things such as proof of concepts to just see what value they can derive for their business. Now, at the minute, the current size of the AI agent market is $7 billion, which is obviously quite a significant amount of money. However, in 2030, which is a little under 5 years away, that market is estimated to be $47 billion. So it's a really significant part of the market. As I've touched on, the OCI service itself, in the last 12 to 18 months since it launched, pretty much every month there's new capabilities being added. So it's really interesting to see kind of where the agent market goes across OCI and also some of the competitors too. Now, this little depiction here shows exactly how much, it's not even a depiction of exactly how much I knew about generative AI and generative AI agents probably a couple of years ago. And the key reason for me putting this is, while I can stand up here talking about the agent service, is that it's not as scary as it seems, and I can demonstrate probably within about 10 minutes of experimentation, you could probably get your first agent up and running. So unlike some other kind of AI concepts, products and services, the AI agent service is really quick and easy to get started with if you're interested in taking a closer look. Now, the key challenge that any business has, so large language models became a thing 3-4 years ago. Everybody jumped on ChatGPT. Absolutely fantastic if you're looking to write a poem or create a recipe. However, it's not so perfect when you need its assistance with business data. And the reason for that is large language models are trained on publicly available information on the internet. As an organisation, your crown jewels, so your sales data, your company policies, your IP, so if you're KFC, your secret herbs and spices recipe, it's all locked away. That's not on the public internet. Large language models know absolutely nothing about that whatsoever. So when you're asking a large language model questions for guidance and support and assistance, they're not very good unless you can blend your business data in with that. And that's one of the things that a generative AI agent do. So it brings the power of an LLM to business data. As I've touched on, your business data is typically private. This is a bridge between the two. So it allows you to use the power of a large language model plus your business data to help users get answers to questions. So providing contextually relevant answers to user questions that are grounded in your business data. So it could be questions about suppliers, it could be questions about policies. We've seen customers use them for things such as internal knowledge bases, for example. And at the minute, there's 3 key places that a generative AI agent can get information from within an organisation. There's a knowledge base, which basically means it can look at documents, so your internal documents that you've got. So that's one area that it can hook into. It can also speak to an Oracle database too, as I'll touch upon later. You've got sales data within the database, then the agent can speak to that too. And then lastly, an API. So this is where agents go from being just question response type systems where you're asking them questions about data to actually interacting with systems. So with the API tool, which I'll go into more detail later on, an agent can actually make calls to internal APIs or public APIs. So for example, could do stuff on behalf of a user. So rather than just purely being used to answer user questions, it can basically be used so users can delegate stuff, get the agent to do it on their behalf. So what are the use cases? So people speak about AI a lot. The one big challenge, and I see this every day because I get customers coming to me going, oh, we really want to do some of this cool AI stuff. Fantastic, right. What use cases have you got? And that's where they're like, oh, yeah, we just want to do AI. Can you help us? Well, the key thing is, my mantra has always been business should drive the tech, not tech driving the business. And I've been through so many waves of tech adoption where that's kind of not necessarily been the case. So the key thing I do with every customer that I've worked with, if they don't have a use case, I need to help them figure out what the challenges are and then map that to it. And over the last probably 12 to 18 months, there's been quite a few separate use cases I've worked with customers on. Some of them are really sexy and cool, others not so sexy. So the key one that's really quickest time to value is HR Policy Assistant. Typically, organisations have got reams and reams of HR policy information. It takes forever for people to analyse it. I was recently with an organisation that explained that, that their staff just do not understand how to do basic things. Even things like maternity leave, you think that'd be a really simple process. It's not out of the ordinary. People go on maternity leave all the time. He explained to me they had a ton of challenges with it. So in that specific case, you can literally throw all of your HR policy document at an agent. Then users can ask questions to the agent and get real-time responses that distill that information. So, rather than having to navigate through maybe 5, 10 policy documents or pages of information to find the answer that they get, the agent can do the hard work for them, go off, get all of the information, figure out what's relevant to them, and provide them with a really concise response to that. The other area that we've seen that's been quite popular, I worked with a local council that had a contact centre that were really overwhelmed. They were getting asked, they didn't have the resources to support the kind of volumes of contacts that were coming in. They had a lot of people that had been there for ages that knew absolutely everything, but they were getting pretty close to retirement. So there's lots of information in people's heads that had not necessarily been captured or was hidden away somewhere where people didn't know. So we went through the process with them of taking that information and training an agent with it. So if you work in the contact centre and you get a bit of a strange question you can't answer off the top of your head, use the agent to ask the question, then get a nice response that you could provide to a resident of that city too. And their plan moving forward was to then make that available to the public too. So if you ever go to navigate a council website, they're never usually that easy to navigate around. Although for most people, the typical use case is, when do my bins get collected? But even by our own local council, they keep moving around where that bit of functionality is on the site. So yeah, I waste far too much time on there. We've also seen internal knowledge assistance as well, where if you've got an IT support team that are trying to reduce their call volumes and make end users a little bit more self-sufficient, throw all of your self-help guides in there and then point users towards the agent initially to get to use the agent to answer their questions, which should reduce the call volume because people can then be a little bit more self-sufficient and have distilled step-by-step guidance too. Now, how does a generative AI agent actually work? Tools, and more tools. So when you deploy a generative AI agent with an OCI, really good, doesn't do anything at all. The key thing that you need to do is to create tools, and the tool basically is a link between the agent itself, your internal systems and data, so that it can actually act upon that. And my analogy is, without a tool, an agent is as useless or as useful as a glass hammer. Interestingly, I was doing a Google image search, tried to get this for the presentation, and it came up Robert Dyers of actually selling one. And for about 30 seconds, I thought, a glass hammer's a real thing. And then I realised there was a little icon in the top right that basically said it was like an April Fool's prank. But essentially, without a tool, an agent doesn't do anything. And I've even put together a pretty diagram for everybody. So if you look at your far left, you've got your typical end user that will speak to a generative AI agent. Now, what the agent actually does is any questions that get asked, the agent itself then figures out what to do with that question. So, okay, A user's asking about HR policy. That means I should probably look at one of my RAG tools. Or users just asked me what our sales figures were for last month. Okay, I'll route that request to the SQL tool. A user has asked me to do their work for them. Okay, it probably means I need to call an API and do some work for them. So this is a typical flow. User asks a question. That gets passed to the generative AI agent. It then figures out which tool to call. It calls the tool, gets the data, works its AI magic, and provides a nice, concise summary to the user. So one term, and I've kind of broken my rule for keeping things as simple as possible, RAG. It gets mentioned a lot. Retrieval augmented generation. It sounds like some really super complex propeller head AI concept. And at first I was like, God, what is this retrieval augmented generation? It's actually a really simple concept. It's a little bit like a detective solving a mystery. So what retrieval augmented generation does, I'll call it RAG from now on so I don't trip up over my words, is it's a detective. You ask it a question. It finds the most pertinent, useful information that's available on that topic and then passes it to the large language model to actually do something with. In most cases, that would be summarize, provide an opinion, provide step-by-step guidance on that. So for example, if it was like a real detective, the information that it could look at would probably be clues and evidence that had been collected. And the second stage would be the generation where it'd provide a response based on that information. So for example, it could be, tell me more about this crime and the suspects. It'd take that information and do something with it. And this pretty diagram hopefully explains what that looks like. So in this concept, we've got company data plus a large language model equals RAG, so retrieval augmented generation. And essentially the goal is to combine business data with AI languages skills to produce better, more reliable answers to end users. And what I've got is a fictitious company called Donut Corp. Now it's getting late in the day and I'm actually quite hungry, and it's probably the worst example for me to use for a demonstration because every time I see it, it makes me hungry. Hopefully folks can see in the back, we've got a generative AI agent that we're going to fire some HR type questions to. Now this has been trained on some basic HR policy data that we've got, but from that, users can ask a simple question and get a really nice concise summary on it. And I'm cheating by recording the demonstrations. Funny enough, every time I do demos that are recorded, I still get that worry that things are not going to work. So a question somebody's asked, they're feeling really stressed about the job, what can they do? Rather than go to the internet on LLM and just get generic guidance, this is actually looking at the HR policy documentation and providing a summary of the information that's contained within that. Similarly, there's a question on, what's the policy on whistleblowing? These are obviously quite deep, complex subjects that folks would go through. We've also got something that's probably a little bit more common. What is a notice period? And this is actually where it does a really good job because there was quite lots of complex logic in the HR policy that I trained this on, and it distills it down to some basic bullet points that explains to end users exactly what the policy is. And then the last one is a simple question that somebody might ask about, I'm working from home, what's the connectivity requirements? This would probably something a little bit more important around the COVID area, but it just gives you a good idea of how it's able to look at a vast body of information and provide a nice, concise summary for it. The other really cool thing that you can do is the output that's being provided here can be completely tailored. So with this agent, I've basically said, explain things simply and use bullet points, but you could get it to respond in any way that you wanted. I've worked with a customer that has basically allowed end users, when they're using an agent, to choose a type of response they want. So it could be that I want you to give me a really super detailed, super in-depth response and get reams and reams of text, which is great. Second option would be give me some basic bullet points so I can get a summary of the topic. And where this has been really useful has been for some of the neurodiverse employees, because it's enabled them to get a response that's tailored to them as an individual rather than like a stock response that would come from the LLM. And it's basically using prompt engineering. I just write in plain English here, use bullet points, keep things simple, and include links to suitable references. Now, I've spoken a lot about how easy it is to configure this. In this demonstration, I'll step through what we actually did here. So we're in the OCI console, and what we've got is we've got a storage bucket, And what I'm going to do is basically put in some content to train the agent on. So if we go into my storage bucket that's called Gen AI Agent KB2, within that we can see we've got our HR manual that's there, that's been loaded. So we've got that stored, it's available within OCI. What we can then do is go into the Generative AI Agent. And if we go into the agent that I created for this demonstration, which is called Demo Agent 2, and if we go to the Tools section, you can see a list of the tools that are registered. And one of the tools that we've got is called HR. And if we click into that, we can then see, firstly, the custom instructions, which gives it information on how it should respond. And then secondly, the knowledge base. And all the knowledge base basically is, in this case, is which storage bucket do I need to look at? And essentially what happens is any content that you put in there, the agent will ingest, vectorize, and then make available for users to ask questions about. In the real world, your company wouldn't have one HR manual. If they did it, we probably wouldn't need this. You know, they'd probably have these vast amounts of documentation. But this is just give you a good idea of how that would be configured and set up. This is the simplest, easiest use case for a Gen AI agent, and I've timed it from start to finish, from literally going, I'd like to create an agent, having one running that you can test. You can do it in less than 10 minutes. So I'd urge you, if you are interested in this, to give it a go. The next thing that we can do is speak into a database. So we've covered our own structured data with the RAG tool. So we've looked at our HR policy. The second one is speaking to a database. Now, I'm absolutely terrible at SQL. Select star from is about the limit of my knowledge. So when I need to get information from a database, I'd maybe use an analytics tool or ask one of the very smart people within my team who does know how to write SQL queries to get the data for me. Now, the SQL tool is really useful because what it allows you to do is take a natural language question. So as an end user using the agent, I can go, hey, what were our 3 best-selling products last week? The agent can take that question, convert into a SQL query, go, Brendan, that's what you're asking, but actually, based on the data that we've got, this is a SQL query that you'd need to run against the data. But rather than going, hey, Brendan, take this query and run it against the database, and nobody would let me anywhere near a prod database, so that's never going to happen. What it can do is run the query in the background for you, and then return the results to the end user, so that the end user can then see them and get that information directly without running any nasty SQL queries, doing anything. And the logical flow of this is as follows. So again, using my end user diagram, user asks a question such as how many widgets we sold, gets passed to the generative AI agent. That converts a natural language question into a SQL query. The next step is to actually run the query itself, then provides the results back to the agent, and then it uses the LLM to write them conversationally. So rather than being kind of like a number, it writes them in a textual format that's nice for end users. One thing to point out without jumping in the weeds too much, you don't actually need to get it to do this bit. So you can literally, if you're like a brand new DBA, you've never used SQL, you could actually just use this as a learning tool and configure it so that it doesn't run the query. It just goes, hey, for that question, this is a query that you need to run against the database. Now, I've got a really good analogy. I'm a massive boxing fan. I don't know if anybody else in the room is. This chap here, Canelo Alvarez, absolutely fantastic boxer. He's from Mexico. He speaks Spanish, obviously. His English isn't great. So whenever he has like a post-fight interview, you've got him. So Canelo is the boxer. The end user is the interviewer, so the person asking them the questions. And then the important person in this is the translator, who essentially is the generative AI agent. So this is similar to kind of how the SQL tool works. You've got the end user asking a question. You can't ask it directly to Canelo because he speaks English, he speaks Spanish. He's just going to look puzzled. So we have to use this intermediary. So the end user, the interviewer, speaks to the translator, who is a generative AI agent, who then speaks to Canelo, gets the response, and then repeats it back in English to the interviewer. So that's kind of a real-worldish analogy of kind of how that could look. And here's a demonstration of it again with Donut Corp, where we're going to take a look at some of our statistics. So first question is, what are the 3 most popular types of donuts? This is where I'm getting nervous, but I know it does work. And then it's providing us with a summary at the bottom, and I've added some extra visualization stuff to make it look a little bit prettier too. Oh, I skipped ahead on that one. I've got some other queries to run. 5 largest customers by sales is another example of a query that we could run. And so on. And all the agent needs to know is what's the database name, what the tables you've got, and tell me a little bit about those tables and column names. So if they're cryptic, give it a little bit of translation. You do that when you set the agent up. You point it to the database, tell it what tables it's got, what information is stored within each table, and also what the columns are. And then based on the query that's asked, it can generally do a pretty good job of figuring out the SQL query to run. For those of you who've used Select AI, an autonomous database, it's basically Select AI, but as part of a generative AI agent. For my final question, you're probably fed up of hearing about donuts now. Which 5 donuts generated the lowest revenue? You see there again, it produces information pretty quickly and in a nice visual format too. So in terms of how it's set up, we've got our very basic donut sales table that I created that's got information on kind of sales, obviously. And then what we do within the generative AI agent if you remember before we went in and we looked at the HR tool, we've got an additional tool now that's called Donut Sales. So if we click into that and we go into edit it, you can see the configuration information available. So we need to tell it what it's actually used for. And this is how the agent knows which tool to invoke. So this is Donut Sales. I provide the schema of the tables that I want it to be able to query. We can provide it with some example queries if it does struggle with some of the questions. Then we also provide the description of the tables and columns. If they're cryptic, like most tables and columns typically are, it basically just gives it a little bit of an English representation of what that is. The database connection tool and whether it actually executes the question or not. So if you remember earlier, I said that it can just send the query back to the user to say, hey, this is a query to return that data. Or if you enable that, it'll go off, run the query, and then provide the end user with the results too. So it's a little bit more complex to configure, but still it's something you can do pretty quickly. If you're familiar with Select AI, pretty much the same concept, but you've just got the wrapper within an agent. The last type of tool that I'll go through, I say passing the buck with an API tool. So this is, so if you think, the RAG tool is used for unstructured data, so documents. The SQL tool that we've just looked at is structured data, such as databases. The API tool, as the name would suggest, can be used to call APIs. So whether that be public APIs or private APIs you've got available within your organization. And it can do stuff. So this could be retrieving customer data from an external system, updating the status of an order, triggering a workflow, or anything else you want. If you like cats like me, you could even get it to query the cat API. And the way that I think about, because this is kind of like a more new piece of technology within the generative AI agent, this is basically passing the buck and having an agent that can actually do stuff on your behalf. So rather than simply asking it a question, getting an answer, you can get it to do stuff for you. So like I say, you know, retrieving a record, maybe possibly sending an email, doing something in the background. And I've got a basic example of this, quite contrived. Imagine I'm in the marketing team and I wanted to shorten a bunch of URLs. So rather than sending customers and having marketing collateral with a URL that's that big for our public website, we want something short and snappy. So what we'll do is we'll use a URL redirection service. Now what you don't want is somebody having to manually do all of that. So what I have done here is create an API tool where you go, hey, could you shorten this URL for me? It'll go off, call a public API for a URL shortening service, shorten the URL, and then provide the URL that's been shortened back to the end user. Quite contrived, Probably low value in reality, but hopefully gives a good view of how an API tool can be used. So what we'll do here is we will basically ask it to shorten the URL. And if you can see, there's a horrible, nasty, long URL there. It'll go off, call the API tool I have configured, shorten the URL for me, and then once it's been shortened, it'll return it back in the response. So you can see here it goes, here's your original URL, here's your fancy new short URL that could be used. Really super simple, super basic, but gives a good example of it actually doing something on behalf of the user and calling an API. Now, in terms of how this is set up, within our generative AI agent, we now have a third tool, which is the URL shortener tool. So when I eventually get in there, we'll see the URL shortener. And within this tool, we provide a description of what it does. And this is so it knows exactly which tool to call when the user asks a question. And then we provide the API schema, which is quite a scary thing, but I cheated and just used AI to generate the schema for me. This is where you do get a little bit more developer-y. And depending on where it is, you can choose to connect it to one of your networks with an OCI. So for example, if you need to reach to an internal system, you could do that and then give it access to maybe an on-premises system. And then once that's been saved, whenever a user asks a question that trips the tool, from the question, it'll go, right, okay, so that's the URL. They've asked me to shorten it. I'll pass it to this tool. And then when I get the response, I will provide them with a shortened URL that comes back from the agent. So I'm going to go through the slides in a slightly different order here. So one thing that typically gets asked is about things like guardrails. So how can we stop users from doing crazy stuff? Because when LLMs became out and there was lots of kind of companies wrapping their services around LLMs, there's some really hilarious stories about people doing all sorts of nasty things that they shouldn't have been doing with this. What we have with an OCI, it's fully configurable. For my demonstrations, it's all turned off, but obviously in the real world, you do something to configure these appropriately. So if we look at the configuration that we have, you've got content moderation. And interestingly for this, you can configure this both on input, as in make sure people don't ask the agent to do nasty things, and also on the output. So it could be that the user asks quite an honest, nice question. For whatever reason, the agent comes up with some very nasty, horrible response. With content moderation, you can configure exactly where that should be, input or output or both. So maybe you want all to be reviewed. So you can disable, which is what I've got, so it just doesn't care. It'll tell you to do anything. Block, which obviously blocks the request, or you've got inform, but it does notify the users about that. So that's just moderation, making sure that people don't ask it to do wacky, horrible, nasty things, or the responses that are provided are not horrible and nasty, and you wouldn't want users to see them. The other two options are PII protection as well. Now, in some cases, your agent may be there to surface PII, so that might be completely valid, but in some cases, it might not be. This gives you the flexibility to decide what you do, whether you kind of block. Whenever it detects any PII, it'll block it from the response. It will not get returned to the end user. It could be that within the knowledge base, you've got like a PDF file that's been ingested about HR stuff, but for whatever reason, HR have got everybody's names and national insurance within that document. That would stop that from getting then returned to the user. Again, that is available in input and output, because there might be situations where input, we need to put in PII, we need to maybe ask a question about an individual employee, but we don't want to see that in the response. We want a decision to be made upon that. If we go back to where I was before, so I spoke about how simple it is to use, but full disclosure, the demonstrations I've done today, I've used a custom front end. I'm not a developer, it's literally less than 100 lines of code, but it makes it look very nice and pretty. For those of you not developer inclined who want to kind of kick the tires on the service, within the OCI console, there is a chat interface. It doesn't look quite as good, I may add, but it gets the job done and it's really good for testing. So if you wanted to have a play around with the service, it's a really good way to just quickly build an agent in 10 minutes. I'll stand by that. It doesn't take that long. you can use the chat interface within the console to ask questions to the agent. Where this is really good as well, you get lots of tracing and logging information too. So it actually enables you to see what's going on under the hood. So let's say, for example, you're doing some testing, you're piloting with end users. They're going, we're getting some weird responses to some of these questions. What's going on? Within the console, you can actually see how the request is dealt with. So it could be that it's maybe calling the incorrect tool, maybe it's pulling some duff information. So you can help tune the agent to kind of improve the quality of responses. So I built a custom front end using Streamlit. Shameless plug. If you'd like to see the code, I've got a blog post that steps through it. If any of you are Apex inclined, there's actually a really fantastic Apex front end that's been developed by the engineering team that you can hook into a generative AI agent. And for lots of use cases, this would be absolutely fine. And obviously, as Apex is free or included in the service, it means that to provide a user interface for your end users, there isn't any additional cost to do that, which is obviously very useful. And I've got a nice little presentation of what this looks like. We've got users out that are actually using the Apex front end with the service and are absolutely fine and happy with it because it does the job. I've also got some useful resources. So I've got short walkthrough videos on YouTube for the SQL tool, the RAG tool, and the API tool. Now, there's one tool I've not spoken about today. It's a little bit more complex, and I only had 45 minutes for the session, but there's also something called a function calling tool. Now, when you've got an application or a front end to a generative AI agent, the function calling tool enables you to run anything you want, really. So let's say there's something that you need to do. You can't use a SQL tool, you can't use a RAG tool or the API tool for whatever reason. Maybe you're speaking some really kludgy, horrible old system, or you need to integrate with some system and none of those options work. The function calling tool enables you to write custom code to retrieve the data and then get the agent to work its magic on it. And there's some really good examples out there on how to use that too. I think the one I've got is I've got it calling an OCI function, but it could be anything really that doesn't fall into those buckets. The other thing to point out about the service, probably the most two questions I get asked about it are, what model does it use? At the minute, it uses Llama. So unlike the generative AI service where you get an option to choose which model, the generative AI agent service currently uses Llama. There's no way to change that. However, in the future, there may be options available for that. And secondly, it's pricing. Customers look and they're going, yeah, this is AI. This is going to be really expensive. How much does it cost? The way that it's charged is based on the questions and responses. So if you've got a really good idea on how the agent will be used, it can be fairly straightforward to price. It's not as simple as something like a VM where you go, yeah, that VM, that much memory, that much disk for a month, yeah, it'll be 40 quid. What you need to understand is exactly how much text will get generated by the LLM. What I typically do with customers is figure out, hey, how many user queries do you expect a week, a month, which typically fairly straightforward to figure out. Then do some testing based on the typical types of questions they want. And then with the console interface that I demonstrated, it shows you actually how many tokens have been generated, and it's that drives the cost of it. With that being said, even for a high throughput local council I worked with, I think it was like 200 or 300 quid a month. So it's not super scary price-wise. It's actually very cheap to implement as well. So I've spoken for 35 minutes without breathing. Hopefully you've all followed okay. I do tend to speak quickly when I get excited. We've got a few minutes now for any questions that you might have about anything that I've gone through, maybe any use cases you've got, anything that maybe needs any clarification.